In this episode, we're going to talk about all of the different headlines that are dominating markets today.
Welcome. Number of issues dominating headlines in the news today. Trans Mountain pipelines, trade negotiations and agreements. So we figured with some of the choppiness in the markets that we're seeing and these headlines that it might be a good idea to sit down and discuss our thoughts around what we're hearing in the media.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about we start, Grant, with the Trans Mountain pipeline? What's the latest on the pipeline and what are some of the expectations?
Yeah, really good question. And, just to catch everybody up on this, because if you haven't paid attention to the articles, you might not know, but the Trans Mountain pipeline, this is the pipeline that the government effectively bought off of Kinder Morgan, and the one that's going to take basically the pipeline out to the West Coast so that we can export more of our oil to different markets. This pipeline has gone through a number of challenges throughout its origin, I should say. And it continues to face more. The point of the government buying it was to push this project through, basically, and push it forward. But there's been some issues that have come up as late, and in fact, just a couple weeks ago, the federal court announced that the government's proposal has failed to tackle a few key issues. One of which is they failed to consult Indigenous peoples in the areas where the pipeline is going to be built, which is obviously a big problem. And then the other one is that they failed to account for the the complete environmental scope of ramifications in the waterways with more oil tankers along the West Coast. And so their environmental report included the land, but didn't include the water, essentially. And that's an issue for the federal court. So where that leaves us today is that this project, which was ready to move forward, is now back basically at the starting point, not at the starting point, but it's back being held up again. And so the government will need to reissue a new proposal that will take into consideration those items, among others. So the good news is I think that the court has essentially laid the groundwork, the pathway to get this project done. They've told them they've told them what they need to get done in order to get this approved and moving forward. But that is going to require some time to get done. So I think that everybody needs to be prepared that this is going to take a little bit longer to get done. But my expectation is the pipeline will get built. I think that this is important to the Canadian economy. At least our government thinks so. And so it's likely that the pipeline gets built. It's just going to take a little bit longer, and it's going to take longer than everybody had originally expected.
NAFTA negotiations. I know last week you were on CJOB all week, and it seemed like the week of NAFTA. Every question that came up revolved around NAFTA. Give us some insight onto what's going on there and what we can hopefully expect moving forward.
Yeah, from a talk radio perspective, it was kind of boring because I was talking about the same thing every day. But certainly this is a big thing for Canadian trade. Our biggest trade partner is the U.S., and so it's important. It's dominating the markets and the headlines. So as of today, as of Thursday, September 6th, when we're recording this, there's negotiations ongoing right now as we speak between Canada and the U.S. and with the hope that we're going to come to a new agreement that will replace NAFTA in the short term here.
Can you talk a little bit about what's holding Canada up from signing this agreement?
Well, I think there's a couple issues that they're holding it up. The main one on the Canadian side, though, is Chapter 19, which is the mechanism for solving trade disputes between the partners in the agreement. So how it is today, it's called Chapter 19 in NAFTA, is that any trade disputes will be solved by a third-party arbitrator. This is worked out. This is something that is really important to Canada because we don't want our trade issues with the U.S. being solved in a U.S. court. Canadians obviously feel that there's a bias there. And so we want a third-party arbitrator, as we've had with the existing NAFTA agreement. Now, the U.S. is they're trying to negotiate against this. They don't want to have a third party. They'd prefer this to be handled internally, basically, within the continent. The main reason for that is because the U.S. has pretty much lost every single trade dispute that they've got into with NAFTA because the third-party arbitrator
so they obviously
decided against it.
Yeah, they obviously don't like this third-party arbitration.
Correct. So that's become a big sticking point. There's other sticking points on the Canadian side where Justin Trudeau, in fact, just came out and said that there's no way we're going to agree to a deal that will allow foreign media companies to come in and buy our media, because it's a cultural thing, and Canada's trying to protect our media outlets so that we can present a Canadian view to Canadians, essentially. So there's some other sticking points in there too. The Chapter 19 one is seemed to be becoming the biggest one at this point, and the thing that seems to be holding up the deal. And I'm sure they're working on a few other deals. Now, there's been a lot of progress made. I mean, with the U.S. and Mexico coming to an agreement within the last 10 days or so, that actually paved the way and moved the ball forward for the Canadian side of the agreement as well. There's just a few sticking points. This is all coming to a head because there is an October 1st ultimate deadline. I mean, I say ultimate because it's important politically, but there is an October 1st deadline to get a deal over to Congress so that Congress in the U.S. can review it, because they really need to get a deal in place before December 1st, because that will get the ball rolling before the new Mexican president takes over government. So it's really important that they get something done before then. President Trump has already come out saying that if Canada is not part of a deal, the U.S. will need to move forward with the U.S.-Mexico deal without Canada in it. And so if the deal is going to be done between the three countries, it's important that the October 1st deadline is met. Otherwise, I mean, there's always potential for more trade deals down the road, but it's in order to keep it together like the way it is, then it would be important for that deadline. So again, my opinion is that there will be a deal done. I mean, this is the way negotiations go. It always seems grim right up until the deadline, and it's because that's when people have actual pressure on them. So I suspect that we're going to get a deal done. I think so. It's going to cause some short-term turmoil in the meantime, and the markets are going to certainly be a little bit more volatile as day in, day out we have positive and negative news on it. But I suspect we'll get a deal done, and this shouldn't have too big of an impact on the long term.
You just touched upon how our view is that over the long term, everything that's going on, really political noise, and there isn't too much value there for someone who is looking to invest over the long term. Talk a little bit about how you feel this affects markets in the short term, and what people should be doing or thinking when they're essentially investing their money during this political turmoil.
Yeah. So I would just reiterate for long-term investors, I wouldn't allow this to don't get emotionally charged on this. Don't allow your emotions to make your investment decisions for you. Because there is going to be a lot of volatility day in, day out while these things are going on. I mean, in the case of the pipeline, I think that's a little bit of a longer term issue because, if we're looking at, again, just my opinion, but I think that there's, with the hiccups in the deal, we may be waiting another 18 months before they can actually move forward in the pipeline. So it's 18 months, then completion, then so on and so forth. So there's going to be some short-term profitability issues perhaps with some of the energy companies who are trying to export out of Canada. So that one might be a little bit longer. I mean, NAFTA, or the trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, that could actually be, it could be solved right now for all I know as we're recording this, but that could happen in a short term, in which case things will move on. So I think one way or the other, if you're a long-term investor, neither of these issues really affect you that much, but they could create opportunities actually, and I think you need to be aware of that. Volatility is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you see a quality company, and we're certainly looking at this, but if we have a quality company that we really like, and all of a sudden the price drops to a really attractive price because of the volatility, or because President Trump said this or that, it becomes a buying opportunity. And so you should be aware of it. Don't be emotional about it, but keep the long term in mind. And go for quality, and don't pay more than you should for an asset, and then you should be just fine, and this might actually be a good thing for you in the long run. If you're invested for the short term, well, this shouldn't affect you either, because you shouldn't be in any assets that are going to be affected with the volatility. So stay away from volatility if you're a short-term investor. If you need the money the next year, I wouldn't be buying stocks, frankly, because we have no idea where they're going to go, and this type of stuff can have a big impact on the short term. But for long-term investors, I would say this may be an opportunity, but it shouldn't affect any of your longer-term assets.
Well, with that, we'll close it off. Hopefully, when this episode is released early next week, we've
might have a deal.
Yeah, maybe we have a deal.
Point.
So keep our fingers crossed. Thanks for tuning in. You can visit us at www.whitehoustonwealth.com. Send us an email, whitehoustonwealth@nbc.ca. Happy to address any questions, feedback, anything like that. So, like we always tell you, we want to hear from you. So
that Ready?
Aim.
Fire.